They spat on her at church, not in metaphor, not as an expression. In the communion line of First Baptist Church in Harlan's Creek, West Virginia, on the third Sunday of Advent, with the choir still humming and the smell of candle wax hanging warm in the air, Ruth Ann Marsh looked her daughter-in-law directly in the face. This small, tired, 63 days postpartum woman in her only good dress, and spat at her feet, deliberately, the way you spit on something you consider beneath the ground you're standing on. 4 people saw it. Nobody moved. Her son Dale was 6 feet away. He looked at the stained glass window above the altar and said nothing. And Celestine Duval, standing in the praise team section in a dress that cost more than June's entire monthly budget, watched it happen with the calm expression of a woman who considered the matter already settled. What none of them knew, what not one single person inside that building understood, was that the ground beneath their feet, the land that church had sat on since 1987, belonged to the woman they had just humiliated. Every acre of it, held in a trust so quietly constructed, so legally precise, that the Marsh family had been living inside June Dillard's inheritance for years without ever once suspecting it existed. This isn't just a story about a woman who was humiliated in church. It's a story about what happens when the people who believe they own everything discover, far too late, who was actually paying for it. If you believe that quiet strength is still strength, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. This community shows up from everywhere, and we want to hear from you. Now, to understand what June Dillard Marsh was holding in silence that morning, and for how many years she had been holding it, we need to go back to where this story really began. The story began, as so many stories in Harlan's Creek did, inside the walls of First Baptist Church on a Sunday morning when everyone who mattered was watching. June Dillard Marsh had dressed carefully that day. The navy dress was the good one, the one she kept folded in the back of the closet behind everything else, the one with the small pearl buttons down the front that her fingers had fumbled with that morning because she was tired in the specific cellular way of a woman who had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in 63 days. She had nursed the baby at 5, dressed her at 6:30, loaded the car seat into the truck while Dale stood in the kitchen drinking his coffee without offering to help, and arrived at First Baptist by 8:55, which was early enough that the parking lot was still half empty, and the candles on the Advent wreath were not yet lit. She had done everything right. She always did everything right. The communion line formed after the second hymn, as it always did. June took her place in the center aisle with the baby pressed warm against her left shoulder, her right hand steadying the child's back through the blanket. The pews on either side were full. The smell of candle wax and pine boughs hung in the air. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Sister Patricia Owens humming softly to herself, the way she always did during communion. Ruth Ann Marsh was 4 people ahead of her in the line. June did not see Ruth Ann turn around. She felt it, the shift in attention that precedes a confrontation, the way the air in a room changes temperature before the words do. And then Ruth Ann was facing her, fully, deliberately, with the composed expression of a woman who had decided something. "A woman living off the charity of this family," Ruth Ann said, not quite a whisper, her voice pitched at that precise register that carries without appearing to be raised, "does not take communion ahead of her betters." 4 people heard it. June watched their eyes move and then move away. Then Ruth Ann drew herself upright, looked directly at June's face and spat. Not at her, at the floor in front of her feet. Slowly, as a statement. Someone nearby made a small, involuntary sound. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. June looked past Ruth Ann to where Dale stood at the far end of the line, near the front of the church. He was looking at the stained glass window above the altar, the one depicting the feeding of the 5,000. He studied it with great concentration. June stepped out of the communion line. She found a seat in the rear pew, the one beside the old iron radiator that knocked twice every 10 minutes, and she sat down with the baby, and she waited. The service continued. From the back of the church, June could see the whole of it, the way a classroom looks different from the doorway than it does from the inside. Ruth Ann returned to the front pew and settled herself with the unhurried movements of a woman who had done what she came to do. Dale took a seat beside her, Celestine Duval stood at the front left in her position with the praise team, wearing a green dress that caught the light from the high windows. And if she had seen what happened in the communion line, she gave no indication of it one way or another. The pastor, Reverend Gerald Booth, delivered his Advent sermon with the practiced warmth of a man who was never in the room where things actually happened. The radiator knocked. The baby slept. June's hands rested in her lap still. After the benediction, she gathered her things and walked to the side exit without stopping to speak to anyone. Behind her, she could hear Dale's voice lifted in easy greeting. The hardware store voice, warm and public, the voice he used when someone whose opinion mattered might be listening. She did not turn around. The parking lot was cold. The mountains behind the church had gone gray with the particular flat gray of Appalachian December, and her breath came in small clouds as she buckled the baby into the car seat. She checked the straps twice. She always checked the straps twice. Then she sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. After a moment, she opened her purse and took out the folded document. It was 3 pages, printed on the letterhead of Ridge and Hollow Holdings, LLC, 4400 Beaumont Center Circle, Suite 309, Lexington, Kentucky. Harlan Stokes had sent it to her 93 days ago, and she had carried it with her, folded into thirds, in the inside pocket of every bag she had used since. She did not read it. She knew it by heart. What she held quietly in the parking lot of First Baptist Church on the third Sunday of Advent was a consolidated asset summary for a mineral rights and land trust covering 14,000 acres of Harlan County Ridge. The trust generated $340 million annually in natural gas extraction royalties. Its consolidated value as of the most recent quarterly assessment stood at $2.1 trillion. Her name was at the top of the document. Not Marsh, Dillard. June Elaine Dillard, sole trustee. The church she had just been asked to leave. The building itself, the land beneath it, every stone of the foundation, sat on a parcel donated by Cora Dillard in 1987 and absorbed into the Ridge and Hollow portfolio at county consolidation. The hardware store Dale ran on Liberation Street leased its commercial parcel through the same trust, renewed every 10 years, renewable at the trustee's discretion. And Ruth Ann's house, the house she had lived in for 31 years, the house she managed like a small empire, sat on a residential parcel that Harlan Stokes had flagged in his last quarterly review. Never invoiced, never reviewed, absorbed in 2003 and overlooked ever since. June had been paying Ruth Ann Marsh's cost of living for 9 years without Ruth Ann knowing her name. She refolded the document along its original creases. She placed it back in her purse. She started the car, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove home through the gray December mountains without the radio on. She was not crying. Her hands were completely steady on the wheel. But something was changing. Quietly, the way seasons change. Not in a single day, not in a single moment, but so certainly that by the time you notice it, it has already been true for a while. To understand what June Dillard carried into that church on Advent Sunday, and why she carried it quietly, you have to understand the woman who put it in her hands. Cora Dillard was not a woman who impressed people immediately. That was, her granddaughter would come to understand, entirely deliberate. She was small-framed and plain dressing, the kind of woman who bought the same style of housecoat in 4 colors and rotated them without ceremony, who drove a 1991 Buick LeSabre until its odometer turned over twice and saw no reason to replace it. She grew her own tomatoes. She attended First Baptist on Sundays and said little during coffee hour. The coal company representatives who came to her kitchen table between 1978 and 2001, 17 of them, across 4 different companies with offers that climbed from polite to extraordinary to something close to desperate, all left with the same answer, delivered in the same unhurried tone, accompanied by a fresh cup of coffee and a slice of whatever she had baked that morning. No, thank you. The land stays. What they could not understand, and what Cora never explained, was that she did not refuse because she was stubborn or sentimental. She refused because she had read every geological survey commissioned in Harlan County since 1962 and understood, with the patience of a woman who thought in decades rather than quarters, exactly what those ridges held. By the time Ridge and Hollow Holdings was formally incorporated in Lexington in 2003, the natural gas extraction rights alone had made the trust's annual yield greater than the GDP of several small nations. Cora noted this in her ledger, closed the book, and went to water her tomatoes. She told June about the trust the summer June turned 18, not with drama, not as a revelation. She sat her granddaughter down at the kitchen table, the same table where the Colemen had sat with their briefcases and their forecasts, and she laid the deed copy in front of her like she was passing the salt. June's hands had gone still on the table. She looked at the pages, then looked up at her grandmother. Cora studied her for a moment. Then she said, "The quiet ones carry the most. That's why they have to carry it in secret." She said it the way she said most important things, simply without decoration, as if it were a fact she was tired of people not knowing. She meant it practically. A woman who displays her resources invites people to calculate her value and then position themselves accordingly. But she also meant it as something deeper. She meant that the specific kind of strength June had, the steady, absorbing, unperformed kind, was not a liability. It was a vault. And a vault only works if people don't know what's inside. She made June memorize Harlan Stokes' phone number before she left the table. The legal architecture Cora had constructed was precise and deliberately protective. The Ridge and Hollow Trust was established as June's separate property in perpetuity, fully insulated from any future marital estate under Kentucky and West Virginia property law. When Dale Marsh proposed 4 years later, and June called Stokes to tell him, the attorney drove to Harlan's Creek the following week with a prenuptial agreement, drafted so quietly and so completely that June signed it in Stokes' Lexington office on a Tuesday morning, told Dale it was routine estate paperwork from her grandmother's affairs, and Dale, who had no particular reason to probe what had always seemed to him like a modest inheritance from an unremarkable old woman, signed the acknowledgement without question. The trust was never mentioned by name. It did not need to be. The confidentiality condition was Cora's final instruction. June was to tell no one, including a husband, including family, until the moment she determined it was necessary. Not out of dishonesty, out of what Cora called appropriate patience. June agreed, and the agreement cost her nothing at the time because she was 22 and newly in love and could not have imagined a world in which the man she was marrying would ever require her to use it. That is the part the audience should hold for a moment. Dale Marsh in the early years was worth loving. He was attentive in the specific, physical way of men who grew up in mountain communities. He fixed things without being asked. He held doors. He introduced June to people at church with a hand at her back and a look that said he knew he'd done well. He laughed easily. He drove the long way home sometimes, just because she mentioned once that she liked the view over the ridge at dusk. On their first anniversary, he left a note under her coffee cup that said only, "You're the best thing I found in this whole county." She kept it in the back of the deed folder for years. She was not sure when she stopped being able to find it. The morning of their wedding, Cora sat in the fourth pew of First Baptist and watched the ceremony with the composed expression she brought to everything. Afterward, in the reception line, she shook Ruth Ann Marsh's hand and held it a beat longer than necessary, studying the woman with the quiet attention of someone completing an assessment. She said nothing beyond the expected pleasantries, but that evening she drove back to Lexington and she called Harlan Stokes and she asked him to add a sealed letter to June's file. He was not to deliver it unless June asked for it, or unless something happened that made it necessary. June did not know about the letter for 7 years. In the meantime, the marriage was good. Her hands were warm in his. She laughed without calculating the cost of it. She taught 3rd grade at Harlan's Creek Elementary and came home to a man who asked about her day, and she thought, with the simple conviction of a woman who has not yet been given reason to think otherwise, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. She believed it completely. She would believe it for longer than she should have. That too was part of her nature, the carrying kind. The year the hardware store's revenue fell for the 3rd consecutive quarter, something in Dale Marsh began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once. These things never announce themselves. They arrive the way cold arrives in the mountains. Incrementally, until one morning you look up and realize the temperature has been dropping for weeks and you somehow hadn't registered when it started. The year the hardware store's numbers turned bad for the third consecutive time, Dale Marsh stopped asking June how her day had been. It was not a dramatic change. That is the thing about this kind of erosion. It never announces itself. There was no argument, no door slammed, no moment June could later point to and say, that was when. There was simply a Tuesday in February when she realized, setting his plate in front of him, that he had not looked up from his phone. And then she realized, with the quiet precision of a woman who tracks things without meaning to, that he had not looked up on Monday either, or the Friday before. She told herself he was tired. The store's Q4 numbers had come in short again. She'd seen the folder on the kitchen counter, the column of figures with a red circle at the bottom. She knew what financial pressure looked like in a man from Harlan's Creek. It looked like silence. It looked like a jaw held slightly too tight at the dinner table. She gave him space the way you give a room air after something has been burning, carefully and with the quiet hope that the smoke will clear on its own. It didn't clear. It thickened. Ruth Ann began appearing on Tuesday afternoons, then Tuesday and Thursday, then most weekdays, always with a reason, a casserole, a question about the gutters, something she'd found in a box from Dale's childhood that she thought he might want to see. She moved through the house June kept with the assessing gaze of a building inspector looking for violations. Nothing was ever quite right. The baseboards, the dish arrangement, the way June folded the kitchen towels. These observations were delivered as concerns, always lightly, always with a small tilt of the head that said, I'm only mentioning it because I care. You keep a busy house for someone who doesn't work, Ruth Ann said once, surveying the living room with the expression of a woman cataloging damage. I suppose that's an adjustment. June said, thank you for the casserole, Ruth Ann, and put it in the refrigerator. She did not tell Dale. She was not sure by then that it would have made any difference if she had. The first time she heard Celestine Duval's name, it was in passing. Dale mentioning that the praise team was doing a regional collaboration, that Celestine had organized the whole thing, that she was, he said, one of those people who just gets things done. He said it the way you say something that doesn't mean anything. June noted the specific lightness in his voice when he said it, and then told herself she was reading into nothing, because that is what a good wife does when she has no proof and loves her husband and wants badly for things to be fine. She told herself that several more times over the following months. She got quite practiced at it. Then came the pregnancy. Something did warm in Dale when she told him. Something real surfaced briefly. He held her in the kitchen for a long moment, his chin on top of her head, and she could feel his chest expand with a breath that seemed to release something he'd been holding. She let herself believe in that moment that the baby would be the thing that recalibrated them, that a child would do what she could not. For a few weeks it seemed possible. He came home earlier. He asked questions. He put his hand on her rounding stomach on Sunday mornings with the uncomplicated tenderness of a man who is still, somewhere underneath everything, the person he used to be. Ruth Ann's response was different. Her response was ownership. Within a week of the announcement, she had begun referring to the baby as our Marsh baby in conversation, had produced a list of family names she considered appropriate, and had started appearing at the house not on Tuesday and Thursday, but nearly every day, positioning herself in June's kitchen with the settled authority of a woman who had already decided whose child this was going to be. She asked June's obstetrician questions during the one appointment Dale brought her to, and the obstetrician, a careful woman named Dr. Patricia Lewin, had looked briefly at June before answering Ruth Ann in the polite, neutral tone of a professional managing a room. June sat in the paper-lined chair and kept her hands folded over her stomach and said nothing. The birth announcement ran in the Harlan County Courier the week after the baby came. June did not see it before it was submitted. She found out about it when Sister Patricia Owens stopped her after service to congratulate the Marsh family on their new arrival. June thanked her and looked at the copy Patricia held out. A small square of text, the baby's name, Dale's name, Ruth Ann's name, the grandparents on the Marsh side. June Dillard Marsh did not appear in it anywhere. The baby had been announced as if she had arrived by other means. Her chest tightened once, hard, and then she breathed through it. She found the gas station receipt 3 weeks later, tucked in the door pocket of Dale's truck when she was clearing out an empty coffee cup. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. On a Thursday in October, the Thursday Dale had told her he was doing inventory with his assistant manager, Kevin Bray. The station was in Pike County, 51 miles from Harlan's Creek. She stood in the cold driveway and looked at it for a long moment. Then she folded it once and put it in the kitchen drawer, underneath the takeout menus and the spare batteries, and she did not open that drawer again for 2 weeks. She told herself, marriages go through seasons. She told herself he is under pressure. She told herself things will improve after the baby settles, after the store figures turn, after the new year. She told herself a great many things in those months with the particular diligence of a woman who was not yet ready to stop believing. She was kind that way. It was always, always her kindness that cost her the most. They did not improve. They accelerated. The baby was 6 weeks old when June's debit card was declined at Harlan's Creek Market on a Wednesday morning. She was standing at the checkout with a cart full of groceries, formula, diapers, the specific brand of oatmeal the pediatrician had recommended, and the card reader beeped twice and showed the word declined in small green letters. The cashier, a teenager named Brody, who had been in June's third-grade class 4 years earlier, looked at the screen and then carefully looked away. June paid with the $43 in cash she had in her wallet. She left half the cart behind. She drove home and put the baby down and called Dale's cell phone, and he picked up on the fourth ring with the flat, already explaining tone of a man who had been waiting for the call. "It's a budgeting thing," he said. "The store's been bleeding. We needed to tighten up." She asked what that meant for the household account. He told her he had set her a weekly transfer of $200. He said it the way you announce a decision, not the way you begin a conversation. She did not raise her voice. She asked carefully whether $200 a week was meant to cover groceries, formula, diapers, the baby's co-pays, and the household utilities that ran in her name. He said she would need to be more organized about it. Then he said he had a supplier call, and he had to go. The line went quiet. June stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Her arms were at her sides. Her jaw was very still. Then she went and picked up the baby, who had started to fuss, and she held her against her chest and breathed until her own pulse steadied. And she did not allow herself to say out loud the things she was thinking, because the baby was too new to the world to hear it. The irony was precise and merciless. The woman he had just put on a $200 weekly allowance was the sole trustee of a $2.1 trillion mineral rights portfolio. Dale Marsh had no idea. He never thought to wonder. Ruth Ann arrived 2 days later, as if she had been waiting for the atmosphere to shift in her direction. She came with a diaper bag she had purchased, the expensive kind, with 12 pockets and an embroidered M on the front, and she placed it on the kitchen counter with the quiet authority of a woman leaving a flag in new territory. She had opinions about the baby's sleep schedule, the temperature of the nursery, the brand of wipes June was using. These opinions were delivered as questions. "Don't you find that brand a bit harsh for a newborn's skin? I wonder if she'd settle better if the room were a little warmer. She looks uncomfortable, doesn't she?" June answered each question politely. She kept her voice even. She thanked Ruth Ann for the diaper bag. Within a month, a particular phrase had begun circulating through the congregation's informal communication network. The phone calls between Sunday services, the conversations after Wednesday Bible study, the quiet exchanges in the First Baptist parking lot. The phrase was struggling a little, and it was always attached to June's name, and it was always delivered with the specific warmth of someone who wanted you to understand they were concerned. Ruth Ann had not said anything untrue technically. She had simply selected which truths to share, and with whom and when. The scene always softened into something practiced by the time it reached its recipients. By the time it reached June, secondhand through Sister Patricia Owens, who mentioned in passing that she had heard June was having a hard time adjusting, it had traveled through enough hands that its origin was untraceable. June thanked Patricia for her concern. She smiled the way she had learned to smile in rooms where the rules were made by someone else. Then came Celestine. She had always been present at church, always visible, always positioned with the easy confidence of a woman who understood spatial architecture. But in the months after the baby's birth, she had become operationally present, on the planning committee for the regional youth conference, on the rotating schedule for Sunday hospitality, in the organizational thread of every ministry event that required a driver or a coordinator or someone to handle logistics. Dale was on the hospitality committee. Dale volunteered to drive to the regional conference in Pikeville. Dale had Celestine's number in his phone under C. Duvall, and June had seen it there once, when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and she had stood very still and looked at the screen until it went dark. She did not mention it. She did not know yet what she would say if she did. What she knew was the body language. She had been a teacher for 4 years. She had spent 4 years reading rooms, tracking children who were pretending nothing was wrong, watching small humans perform normalcy while something else moved underneath. She knew the specific way two people stood when they were trying not to stand close. She knew it because she watched Dale and Celestine after service one morning, a careful 3 feet apart, and recognized the deliberate nature of the distance between them. The insurance documents surfaced on a Tuesday in October. She was looking for the baby's health insurance card. It had to be submitted to the pediatrician's office by the end of the week, and she found the folder in the drawer of Dale's home office desk where he kept the store paperwork. She opened it because it was labeled Marsh Family Hardware, General Liability, and she thought perhaps the health policy had been misfiled. The beneficiary designation form was in the front section. Her name had been removed. Ruth Ann Marsh was listed as primary. The date of amendment was 6 weeks after the baby was born. June closed the folder. She put it back exactly as she had found it. She stood in the quiet office for a moment, one hand flat on the desk, breathing steadily through the particular sensation of understanding something fully for the first time that you have been half knowing for months. She went to the kitchen. She picked up her phone. She called Harlan Stokes in Lexington, not to instruct him, not to act, just to ask a single question she needed answered before she could think about anything else. If the marriage ends, she said, is the trust protected? Stokes did not hesitate. Completely, he said. Entirely. It was structured that way from the beginning. Thank you, June said. She hung up. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the gray November ridge, and something inside her, not hard, not sharp, but absolutely final, settled into place like a door closing on a latch. This was not a season. This was an ending, and Dale had already been deciding what she would be left with. He had simply forgotten that she was not the one who needed to worry about that. 3 weeks later, it was Advent Sunday. Now the audience knows what the opening scene could not yet tell them. Now every detail of that morning carries its full weight. Go back to it with that understanding, and it lands differently. It lands the way truth always lands when you finally have the context for it. Heavier and harder to look away from. June dressed the baby first, always the baby first, in those early postpartum weeks, because if she started with herself, she would run out of time. She pulled on the navy dress with its pearl buttons, the only dress she owned that still fit across her chest, her body still soft and full in ways that were not yet her own again. And she loaded the diaper bag in the car seat and carried both to Dale's truck because her own car had a slow tire she'd mentioned twice, and he hadn't gotten to. Dale stood in the kitchen drinking coffee. He did not offer to carry the car seat. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and walked past her to the truck without comment. They drove to First Baptist in the particular silence of a marriage that has stopped pretending. The parking lot was already filling when they arrived. Dale got out, nodded to 2 men from the deacon's board, and fell into easy conversation before June had finished unclipping the baby from the seat. She hoisted the carrier, settled it against her hip, and walked in alone. Her back ached in the specific low way it had since the birth, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, just exists as a constant background cost. Celestine Duvall was already in position at the front left of the sanctuary, where the praise team arranged themselves before the service. She stood with the composed ease of a woman who had arrived early and wanted that noticed, her folder held at her side, her posture unhurried. When Dale entered the sanctuary 3 minutes later and took his seat in the front pew beside his mother, Celestine's eyes tracked briefly in his direction and then returned forward. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. June, settling into a middle pew with the baby, clocked it with the tired precision of a woman who had stopped telling herself she was imagining things. Ruth Ann was already seated, immaculate as always. A deep burgundy dress, not a thread out of place. The kind of presentation that communicates, in Harlan's Creek social language, that one has arrived from a house in order. She had saved the seat beside her for Dale with her coat draped across it, and when he sat down she patted his hand once without looking at him, the reflex of a woman who had been managing this particular man's public composure for 36 years. She did not acknowledge June's arrival. That was its own kind of statement. The communion line formed after the second hymn, as it always did. The congregation rose and arranged itself in the center aisle with the practiced rhythm of long habit, and June took her place with the baby against her left shoulder. She knew by then what was coming. Not the specific form of it, not the exact words, not the spit, but she had lived inside Ruth Ann's management of her for 3 years, and she could read the particular set of the woman's shoulders from 30 feet away. Something had been decided. Ruth Ann turned in the line. She delivered the words about charity and standing at her precise, caring whisper. The 4 nearest people, Brother Calvin Watts, Sister Donna Presley, Deacon Roy Hensley's wife Marcia, and a teenage girl named Amber Watts who would tell her friends about it afterward and be told to hush, heard every word and did nothing. Then Ruth Ann drew herself upright and she spat, at June's feet, deliberately. Dale was 6 feet away at the head of the line. He looked at the stained glass window above the altar, the one depicting the feeding of the 5,000. He gave it his complete attention. The irony was precise enough to cut. The man who had reduced his wife to $200 a week, who had removed her name from the beneficiary documents, who had stood in this same building week after week performing the role of a Harlan's Creek pillar. That man was standing on land his wife's grandmother had donated in 1987. The woman who had just spat at June's feet had been sleeping, 31 years, on a parcel that June Dillard held in trust. And the building itself, the floors, the pews, the cornerstone, every inch of the foundation, had been Dillard land since before Ruth Ann Marsh had ever set foot inside it. June stepped out of the line. She found the rear pew. She sat. She listened to the sermon with the blank, internal composure of a woman who has nowhere left to put the things she is carrying. Reverend Booth preached from the book of Luke, the Magnificat Mary song, the part where the humble are lifted and the proud are scattered. June held the baby and looked at the back of Ruth Ann's head in the front pew and said nothing, thought nothing that she would have permitted herself to say out loud. After the benediction, a woman named Sandra Combs stopped her near the side door. Sandra was not unkind. She was the specific kind of well-meaning that does damage without malice. She said she hoped June was doing all right, that she knew it could be hard adjusting to a new family's ways, and that if June just made a little more effort to fit in with the Marshes, things would likely smooth out. She patted June's arm. June said, "Thank you, Sandra. I appreciate that." She smiled the way she had learned to smile. Outside, the December air hit cold and clean. She walked to the truck through the half-empty parking lot, past the old stone cornerstone set into the church's east wall. She had passed it 100 times, but today she stopped. She looked at the engraved text she had read before without registering. Land donated by the Dillard family, 1987. And she reached out and ran one finger across the carved letters of her grandmother's name. The stone was cold and solid under her hand. Then she kept walking. She buckled the baby into the car seat with careful, practiced hands, checking the straps twice. She got behind the wheel. She did not start the engine. She sat in the quiet of the truck cab with the baby making small, contented sounds behind her and the mountains gray and still through the windshield. And she breathed, and she did not allow herself to cry, and she thought about what she was going to do next without yet knowing the answer. That evening her phone rang. The house was quiet when she got home. Dale had stayed to talk with the pastor after service. She had seen him in the parking lot still, easy and unhurried, as she pulled out, and she did not know when he would return, and found, settling the baby into the nursery, that she had stopped tracking his schedule the way she once had. That small surrender told her something she did not yet want to name. She fed the baby and changed her, and held her in the rocking chair by the window, while the December light outside went gray and then dark, and the mountains disappeared into the kind of flat early evening black that comes fast in Appalachian winter, all at once, like a curtain dropping. The baby smelled of warm milk and the specific sweetness of new skin. June held her and rocked and did not think about the church, or Ruth Ann, or the cornerstone plaque under her grandmother's name, or the insurance documents in the drawer. She was not suppressing any of it. She was simply too tired to carry everything simultaneously, and she had learned in the 63 days since the birth to set things down in moments like this one. Her phone buzzed on the windowsill at 6:47. The screen read, Stokes, H. She answered on the second ring. June! His voice was the same as it always was, measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who had delivered important information for 40 years and understood that how you said a thing mattered as much as the thing itself. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. She told him it was fine. The baby was settled. He said he had 2 items for her consideration. The first, the commercial lease on the Liberation Street property, Marsh Family Hardware's address, was coming up for its decennial renewal in the spring. Ridge and Hollow Holdings' property management team had flagged it for trustee instruction. Did she wish to proceed with standard renewal terms, renegotiate, or let it lapse? June said nothing for a moment. She kept rocking. The second item, he continued, was one the title review team had surfaced in a routine portfolio audit. A residential parcel at 414 Creekside Road, she would know it as the Marsh family home, had been absorbed into the Ridge and Hollow residential holdings during the 2003 county-wide consolidation. It had never been formally invoiced. It had been sitting in the portfolio for 22 years without billing, flagged now only because the audit had finally reached that section of the residential register. He asked whether she wished to initiate billing, and if so, whether she wanted it backdated to date of absorption or from the current quarter forward. The room was very still. The baby had fallen asleep against June's shoulder, her small weight warm and absolute. June held the phone and sat with what Stokes had just told her. Ruth Ann's house. The house Ruth Ann had managed like a fiefdom for 31 years. The house from which she had orchestrated 3 years of careful diminishment. The house she had never once, in all that time, paid a single dollar to occupy. Because the land beneath it had belonged to Cora Dillard, and then to June, and Ruth Ann had not known, and had never thought to find out. Something shifted in the quiet of the nursery, not dramatically, not with heat or force. It was more like the feeling of a key turning in a lock that has been waiting a very long time. The quiet ones carry the most. That was what Cora had said. That's why they have to carry it in secret. June had understood that years ago, as instruction, as Cora's way of telling her to keep the trust protected, to live modestly, to give no one a reason to calculate what she held. But sitting in the rocking chair in the dark, with the baby sleeping and the mountains invisible behind the window, and Harlan Stokes waiting patiently on the other end of the line, she understood it for the first time as something else entirely. Cora had not been telling her to hide because she was vulnerable. Cora had been telling her to wait because patience was its own form of power. And silence, held long enough, held at the right moment, became the most complete kind of authority there was. June had been waiting. She had not known she was waiting, but she had been. Not yet, she said on the lease renewal. Stokes said he understood. He would hold the renewal at the standard rate pending her instruction. She asked him then for Pamela Cortez's number. A brief pause. I have it here, he said. He read it to her. He did not ask why she was asking, because he was Harlan Stokes, and he had been waiting for this call for 11 months, and he knew better than to fill silence that did not need filling. She thanked him and hung up. She sat for one more moment with the sleeping baby. Then she dialed Pamela Cortez. The call was answered on the second ring. A woman's voice, unhurried, precise, with the particular quality of someone who does not waste words because she has learned exactly what they cost. June said her name, her full name, not Marsh. Dillard. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Pamela Cortez said, I've been waiting for your call. June said, I know. She put the baby down in the crib with the careful, practiced movements of a woman who has done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more. She stood over her daughter for a moment in the dark. This small person who bore the Marsh name in the county paper, but who carried, in her blood and in the trust documents filed in Lexington, something the Marsh family would never fully reach. Then June sat back in the rocking chair. She did not turn on the light. She sat in the dark, in the room that smelled of milk and wood smoke and her daughter's warmth, and she was still. Not the stillness of someone absorbing a blow. Not the stillness of someone holding themselves together. The other kind. The kind that comes after a very long time of carrying something carefully when you finally set it down in exactly the right place. She was 31 years old. She was 63 days postpartum. She was tired in ways that would take months to fully repair. She was, for the first time in longer than she could precisely identify, entirely herself. Pamela Cortez filed the initial documentation the following Monday morning. The process, she had told June in their second call, would take 11 weeks. June said that was fine. She could wait. She had always been good at waiting. 11 weeks is not a long time. It is long enough. The mediation room at the Harlan County Courthouse was on the second floor, a windowless rectangle with a laminate table and 6 chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Dale's attorney, a man named Boyd Callister, who had practiced family law in the county for 22 years and knew exactly what these rooms were for, arrived first and arranged his papers with the practiced ease of a man who believed he controlled the terms of the morning. He had reason for that confidence. He had built his case on a single premise, that June Dillard Marsh had contributed no financial assets to the marriage, and it was a premise he had every reason to believe was airtight. Dale sat to Callister's left, broad-shouldered and tightly held, wearing the expression of a man who had already mentally moved into the next chapter of his life. He did not look at June when she came in. He had not looked at her directly in 3 weeks. June sat across from him. Pamela Cortez sat beside her, a single manila folder on the table in front of her, closed. Callister opened. He outlined his position in the practiced cadence of a man who had made this particular argument before, that the marital estate consisted primarily of the Marsh family hardware business and the jointly occupied property on Creekside Road, that June had made no financial contributions during the marriage, and that in light of her limited earning capacity and the ongoing needs of the minor child, his client was prepared to offer a monthly stipend of $1,800 and a parenting arrangement in which June would have supervised visitation on alternating weekends. He said the word supervised without any particular emphasis, the way you say a word you have chosen carefully and want to land without appearing chosen. Pamela Cortez did not argue. She did not speak. She opened the manila folder, removed a single sheet of paper, and placed it on the table in front of Boyd Callister, face up. It was the Ridge and Hollow Holdings Consolidated Asset Summary. 1 page. At the top, the trust's name and registration number. In the middle, the asset categories: mineral extraction rights, commercial property holdings, residential portfolio, liquid reserves. At the bottom, the consolidated value as of the most recent quarterly assessment. The number was $2.1 trillion. Above it, in the trustee field, printed in standard 12-point font, June Elaine Dillard, sole trustee, not Marsh, Dillard. Callister read it once. He read it again. Something crossed his face that was not an emotion so much as the collapse of a framework. The specific expression of a man whose entire morning has just reorganized itself around a fact he was not given. He asked for a recess in a voice that was considerably quieter than the one he had been using. He and his paralegal, a young woman named Tricia Watts, who would tell people about this room for years, stepped into the hallway. Dale was left with the document. He picked it up. He read the trustee line first, then the asset figure. He set it down and did not pick it up again. He sat very still, and in that stillness there was something the narrator will not rush past, because it was not fury, and it was not calculation, and it was not the response of a man already planning his next move. It was the response of a man who had loved someone adequately, then poorly, then not at all, and who was now sitting with the full weight of what that had cost. He did not speak for 90 seconds. June did not look away from the table in front of her. She did not offer him anything. Cortez then placed the second document, a single-page parcel deed, Lot 7, Block 4, Creekside Road, absorbed into Ridge and Hollow Holdings residential portfolio, September 2003. The address at the top was 14 Creekside Road, Ruth Ann Marsh's address, never invoiced, sitting in the portfolio for 22 years, generating no revenue, encumbering no one, until now. Callister returned from the hallway. He sat down. He did not make eye contact with Dale. He gathered his papers into a neat stack that he did not then refer to, and he said, in the voice of a man choosing his words with the precision of someone who has just changed his entire position, that he thought it might be appropriate to revisit the framework of the mediation. The rest of that morning was formal and procedural and entirely inverted from how it began. June did not gloat. She answered the questions put to her in short, precise sentences, her voice level and her hands still in her lap. She had been good at waiting. She was equally good at this. 1 week later, on the first Thursday of April, the First Baptist Church held its spring stewardship meeting in the main sanctuary. It was a community gathering, a recognition of local landowners and supporters, an accounting of the church's assets and commitments. Reverend Booth presided. The pews held perhaps 60 people, most of them the same faces that filled them on Sundays. Ruth Ann Marsh was in the second row, in a gray dress, composed as always. Pamela Cortez was not present in person. She had submitted a formal written inquiry on behalf of Ridge and Hollow Holdings, LLC, requesting that the church's historical deed record be formally corrected to reflect current trust ownership and trustee identity. The inquiry cited the original 1987 donation documentation and the 2003 portfolio consolidation. It was a single page, on law firm letterhead, entirely procedural in tone. Reverend Booth read it aloud because it had been submitted for the record and the record required it. He read the trust name. He read the parcel description, the land beneath the building, the parking area, the eastern grounds. He read the trustee name, June Elaine Dillard. The room was quiet in the specific way of 60 people understanding something simultaneously. Reverend Booth, to his credit, kept his voice even throughout. In the praise team section to the left, Celestine Duval sat with her music folder open in her lap. June did not watch her directly, but she registered the moment, 30 seconds after Booth finished reading, when Celestine quietly closed the folder, rose without drawing attention, and walked to the side door at the end of the row. She pressed it open with one hand. She did not look back. The door swung shut behind her without a sound. Then something settled. The room was still processing. People were turning to each other, beginning the quiet recalibration that communities undertake when a long-held understanding has been corrected by documented fact. Ruth Ann had not moved. She sat in the second row with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed forward, and her face held the expression of a woman who has been wrong in public for the first time in 30 years and does not yet know what to do with that. June rose from her seat in the third pew. The pew Ruth Ann had occupied for a decade, the pew with the best morning light, and she walked to the aisle. She paused beside the second row. She looked at Ruth Ann directly, without heat, without performance, with the complete steadiness of a woman who has nothing left to prove and knows it. "I never lived off your family," June said. "Your family lived on mine." She did not wait for a response. She walked to the back of the church and out through the main doors into the April afternoon, where the light was warm and the mountains had gone green again, and the air smelled of new growth coming up from the valley floor. The room behind her was still very quiet. The consequences that followed were swift, institutional, and complete. What followed was not a story June told with satisfaction. It was simply what happened, the way weather happens, the way seasons turn without asking anyone's permission. The Ridge and Hollow Holdings commercial lease on Liberation Street came up for renewal in May. Harlan Stokes submitted the revised terms at market rate, a figure that reflected the actual value of the parcel, not the legacy rate Marsh Family Hardware had been paying for a decade. The new annual figure was $94,200. The previous rate had been $31,000. Dale's business manager, a quiet man named Terry Fulton, who had worked the store for 11 years, called Stokes's office twice to negotiate. Stokes was polite and final. The terms were the terms. The hardware store closed its doors on a Friday in November, 8 months after the stewardship meeting. Dale put a paper sign in the window. It said, "Thank you, Harlan's Creek, 22 years." The sign was still there at Christmas. Celestine Duval transferred her church membership to First Calvary in Pikeville within 3 weeks of the stewardship meeting. She did not announce it. One Sunday, she was in the choir loft. The next, she was not. A few people asked after her. No one had a satisfying answer. Dale, who had staked a significant portion of his sense of the future on her continued presence in it, did not speak publicly about the transfer. He did not speak publicly about much after April. He called June's phone 3 times between May and August. She looked at the screen each time. She did not answer. She was not performing coldness. She had simply arrived finally at a place where the call had nothing to offer her that she needed. And she had learned at considerable cost to trust that assessment. Ruth Ann received the certified letter from Ridge and Hollow Holdings Residential Division on the second Tuesday of May. It was addressed to Ruth Ann Eleanor Marsh, 414 Creekside Road, Harlan's Creek, WV. It was a formal invoice for residential land use, backdated 90 days for Parcel 7B of the Creekside Road Residential Holdings. The trust account listed as the billing entity was administered by June Elaine Dillard. Ruth Ann did not respond to the invoice. She did not appear at First Baptist the following Advent Sunday or the one after that. The third pew sat without its customary occupant for the first time in 30 years, and no one who had been there on the April stewardship meeting made any particular comment about it, because there was nothing left to say that the record had not already said more permanently. The divorce was finalized in September. June kept her name as it appeared on the trust documents. Dillard. She and the baby moved in October, not far, as she had told herself she would not go far, but to a place that was entirely her own choosing. A small house on the east side of the county with a porch that faced the morning light and a yard that backed up against a stand of old hemlocks. The baby, who was now 10 months old and pulling herself upright against every available surface with the focused determination of someone who has decided walking is the next reasonable project. Approved of the hemlocks. She pointed at them frequently and with great conviction. The scene softened in those autumn months into something June had not felt in so long she had almost stopped expecting it. Not happiness exactly. Or not only that. More the feeling of occupying your own life without apology, of waking up in the morning and not calculating anyone else's mood before your feet touch the floor. She cooked what she wanted. She read after the baby slept. She called her friend Donna Presley twice a week and let the conversations run long. She took the baby to Cora's farmhouse on a Saturday in October and walked the property in the cold air and felt in her bones the specific weight of what Cora had preserved and what she was now responsible for carrying forward. The quiet ones carry the most. That's why they have to carry it in secret. She did not think it in Cora's voice anymore. It was simply something she knew, the way she knew her own name, the way she knew the road home. It was not a lesson she was still learning. It was a truth she had finished learning and now simply lived inside. On the first Advent Sunday after the reveal, June dressed the baby in her good red sweater and drove to First Baptist Church and arrived at 8:55, as she always did. She walked inside. She chose the third pew. Not because it had belonged to Ruth Ann. That fact was, to her, simply a detail. But because the morning light came through the high east window at that angle and fell across the floor in a wide gold stripe, and her daughter, settled in the carrier at her chest, reached for it with both hands the moment they sat down. The congregation filled in around her, and some of them knew everything, and some of them were still putting it together, and some of them had been in this building their whole lives without once looking at the cornerstone. And that was all fine. Knowledge arrives on its own schedule. This is what those of us who watch this story should carry with us. That quiet strength and passive acceptance are not the same thing, and never were. That a woman who absorbs cruelty without display is not a woman without power. She may be the most powerful person in the room. That the people who mistake silence for smallness are making an error they will eventually have to account for, in documents, in public, in rooms they thought they controlled. June Dillard had known, from the time she was 18 years old, exactly what she held. She had simply been waiting for the moment that required her to say so. If there is a woman in your life who carries everything quietly, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and who this story made you think of. June reached into her bag and took out the folded deed copy. 3 pages, letterhead worn soft at the creases from years of being carried and handled and put away and taken out again. She held it in her lap. The baby, still reaching toward the light on the floor, made a small sound of focused wanting. June whispered to her daughter, "We were always home, sweetheart. They just didn't know it." The baby reached for the light coming through the window. June let her,